Thank you so much, and I appreciate all of you tuning into this presentation. Given all of the change and upheaval in the world around us, I actually thought a lot about how I might want to adjust what I'm presenting today. But the truth is, our current situation, as you've heard, has made a lot of these concepts even more relevant. As you've been hearing, digital disruption is speeding up. Even the companies that are unable to invest at the moment are having conversations to be poised and ready for tomorrow. So as we go through this presentation, you'll be missing some of my best moves, like tripping over my own feet, but I'll be covering a lot of ground. If there's any topic where you'd like more information or stories or examples, please don't hesitate to reach out. Let's start with the big picture, and then I'll get into more about what's happening inside the firms. Accounting firms aren't strangers to terms like innovation or transformation. They're used in a lot of meetings, in a lot of marketing, and in a lot of proposals. And if you're listening to this, you're more likely adept than most at using terminology around AI. But disruption seems to be a scary one for a lot of people, and rightfully so. We're in an industry that hasn't undergone any massive changes in recent years, and that makes us ripe for disruption. And let's face it, accounting dates back to record keeping from the ancient Egyptians and Babylonians, right? They were using individual ledgers to record transactions that were largely narrative in style. They were exchanging 3 dozen eggs for a satchel of grain. They were even using auditing systems. So probably the first major evolution we saw in bookkeeping occurred when currencies emerged, and we moved to the more recognizable single entry style. And then it's more likely you've heard of the Italian monk whose guide during the late 15th century widely publicized the double entry bookkeeping system. And that allowed for things like a balance sheet to best demonstrate a company's financial strength. But honestly, it really hasn't changed much since then. And it's probably not going to be one of your peers who's going to disrupt accounting. In fact, there were a lot of people predicting that some stealth, sleek tech company would upend the accounting industry. Some people were even betting on firms like Amazon. But that's actually not at all what's happening. There are a lot of really impressive tech companies getting into the accounting space. But instead of pushing out the accounting firms, they want to work with them. Just think about this conference and your own experiences with MindBridge AI. That being said, to optimize working with these tech partners, many firms do need to undergo some transformation. The first is around digitization and automation. Accountants need to get comfortable with digital disruption and moving away from paper and PDFs. I'm not going to send anyone into complete shock and talk about moving away from Excel right now, but simply digitizing and cleaning up and properly storing the data you have is probably the most fundamental thing that needs to change, and one of the best places to start. You need to be in sync with what's happening around you. Secondly, you need to think about your value, the work you're going to be doing. These tech companies, and in some firms, even the tools that they're developing, are taking care of the data entry, the repetitive tasks, the analytics. Now you get to dig in and use this information to really help your clients in a whole different way. That's the biggest piece you should be considering now. And it's why I have the train on this slide. You've probably been wondering about it, but I'm really not implying that anyone's firm is a train wreck. Rather, along with the Industrial Revolution and the development of corporations, it was actually the rise of the railroads that were one of the forces to help create the new needs that led to a formalized accounting profession. Right? The trains provided a distribution network that ultimately shrunk the country. Goods can now reach people in a whole different way. So business transactions increased in speed, and it allowed accountants to add value regarding the financial health of companies. They were able to look at a whole new range of metrics for financial statements, things like operating ratios, and they were able to provide businesses data they needed to make informed decisions. On the flip side, income statements and cash flow helped investors make better decisions about where to put their money. If you think about the changing role of the accountant and its increase in significance, this is the kind of change that's happening right now. You no longer need to worry about the routinized tasks. Your clients want more from you. And that leads to the second reason I have the train on the screen. As the industry developed, the railroad industry developed across the country, it was booming. And it made a lot of people very wealthy. But then it saw a sharp decline. It didn't stop growing because needs changed. In fact, passenger and freight transportation increased, it grew, but the railroads failed to define themselves properly. They defined themselves by their products, the railroad, the trains, instead of by focusing on customer needs, transportation. And by doing that, they failed to diversify and reposition themselves when other methods of transportation emerged. And eventually, those alternatives grew and cannibalized a lot of the need for trains, although we won't get into what's happening in the airline industry right now. So as technologies emerge that fulfill some of the repetitive and standardized accounting tasks, What is the value that accountants can provide? How do you define the value that your firm can provide? Right? Is it oriented around your services, around the products you deliver, your deliverables, or your client needs? Does it allow you to adapt? Does it give you room to grow, opportunity to change? What value are you providing to your clients? So the railroads were an example of failure, but there are some great examples of companies that have redefined themselves. Hollywood was originally all about movies, the product it originally produced. But before it collapsed, they redefined themselves as entertainment, the value it provided. That opened the door to limitless possibilities. Let me tell you, because if you download for the Frozen movies, it's not a single purchase. It's almost a promise to buy games, clothing, puzzles, dolls, coloring books, you name it. But I understand accounting is not the entertainment industry. So where does that leave you? It leaves you with something that's really difficult, right? You need people to drive innovation, and you need people to adopt the change. So for the people across the firm hearing about this who need to adopt it, it's easier to embrace something like innovation because innovation sounds exciting. It's great to say to prospects and recruits, and it's relatively intangible. So there's no immediate call to action or for people to change. Now, from a leadership perspective, innovation is a commitment of present resources to future expectations, right? That involves a lot of uncertainty and risk. And it's even riskier because very few of the people who engage in these kind of innovation projects actually know what they're doing or what's going to work best. There is a lack of methodology that leads to more failures more often than not. But at the same time, if you're only going to allocate the resources that you have to the crises today, you're not going to be relevant tomorrow. But for the people now, so you allocate the resources, things start to change, but the people who have to adopt this, change is very uncomfortable. And it goes over about as well as when I tell my daughter she needs to go to sleep, as you can see in that picture. Most people have been guided to follow directions and not rock the boat, right? Amy was saying that earlier. And there's a great short story to illustrate this called The Little Boy by Helen Buckley, if you want to look it up online. If you've been trying to help, right, if you've been trying to help your children with the new math, you can probably relate easily to how hard it is to approach something differently because you didn't learn math that way. Think about all of the people in your firms who continued in school where they learned how to follow directions and then went into roles created by following the rules, following regulations, helping with compliance, meeting deadlines, following the forms, following a standardized process. You're in a rules-based profession. You learn the rules, then you guide your clients and ensure they follow the rules. Then you teach your staff the rules. Then you write and speak about how to apply the rules. And even when a rule changes, there's immediately a call for follow-up guidance. It's a wait, don't do anything. We need further directions and explanation on how to do this. So innovation is not just taking the path less traveled, it's charting a completely new path with little guidance, few established rules, moving away from filling in forms and checking boxes. Now you simply have to improvise customized advice for a client. That's pretty scary. And we're in a period of continuous transformation. There's a lot of uncertainty, ambiguity. It's critical to constantly learn new things, new tools, and new ways to do your job, right? Just the idea of auditing digital assets has wreaked havoc across the industry and the alphabet soup of agencies. Learning how to discuss cryptocurrencies is like learning a new language. The time horizon for the usefulness of any knowledge you have from college, grad school, or even a training class you just took is getting shorter and shorter. The lifespan of technology and tools that you employ and invest in is getting shorter and shorter as well. Ultimately, you're changing the job of somebody who has likely gravitated to a profession with rules and standardized processes and saw stability. You're changing their work and how they do it. But if you don't create a new culture of continuous learning and adapting to changing internal and external circumstances, you're not going to grow and you're not going to be relevant in the future. So how do you approach this with your firm and your team so that they'll actually embrace the transformation rather than run and hide from it or rally against it? So when computers became more prevalent in the 1980s, there was a book called The Electronic Sweatshop. This woman, Barbara Garson, was talking about computers transforming the office of the future. But she focused on how computers could run anything, from McDonald's to the role of a therapist. And it intensified automation in people's minds. So they lost interest in participation. They didn't see a need to develop their skills. They felt that their contributions are devalued. And we saw that now, right? In 2017, I think it was Mark Cuban who said accounting work will be replaced by robots. And he wasn't the only one expressing that sentiment, so people get scared. Some accounting roles and functions may very well be replaced by computers or robots, but the remaining jobs actually require a lot of human judgment, just like was being discussed. And it's that creativity that's very difficult to automate. So the profession isn't really disappearing, right? Applying expertise as a job function is much harder to automate than data collection, processing. The marketplace is already demanding higher value services, right? CPAs need to provide advice at more sophisticated levels. Technology, transformation, digital disruption, it's all enabling CPAs to do that. In around the same time frame as the other book, there was a book called In the Age of the Smart Machine. And in it, Shoshana Zuboff discussed how that intense automation was not the best way to discuss this kind of change, but rather focus on how new technology can benefit from coupling it with intellectual capabilities, right? Knowledge work. It's hard for most people to grasp or even conceptualize and design the opportunities that can emerge from new technologies. When computers first wound up on people's desktops, they were seen as cool word processors or really exciting new calculators. Or as Alan explained in the last panel, they were simply using technology to replicate what they were already doing. They couldn't imagine how those tech capabilities could or would transform everything from work to organizational design to communication. People could communicate and collaborate now with ease and speed. So there was a big move around re-engineering, and people thought it was layoffs, but in fact, they were trying to figure out, companies were learning how to restructure themselves, embrace new skills, leverage all the opportunities these new technologies presented. So when you present the messaging to your teams, you're increasing the intellectual content at every level. You can frame change with, are we all going to be working for a smart machine? Or will we have smart people around the machine? We can focus on leveraging tools to drive different conversations. How can we make the insight the analytics are providing actionable for our clients? How can they use it to better their businesses? There's really an opportunity to increase consultative relationships and just overall improve the value of our relationships with our clients. So you're making people valuable, but you need to promote in your firms people who want to learn, who can think critically, right? Their accounting skills are foundational, but their minds need to be able to process more than that. So here's where you can really start figuring out how you as a firm can use technology as a competitive advantage, right? There's room out there for all of the firms to use it very differently. So there's no perfect way to put in place an innovation program, right? You need to think about the context of your firm's culture, your budget, your resources, the existing skill sets of your people. And considering structure helps, even if the structure isn't ideal at first. So let's look at definition. When EisnerAmper launched its innovation initiative, one of the first steps was defining innovation. And all we did was call it positive change. So what it meant was you weren't putting pressure on people to boil the ocean. We promoted things that had already been done. Something as simple as a dialog box that popped up before you sent a reply all email to a large number of people. And it checked to make sure you actually wanted to do that. It was positive change. Then you need to focus, right? Focus is important because it will, to some degree, dictate the problems that you're going to solve, the needs or opportunities you'll address. If you just are betting on a firm-wide call for innovative ideas, the engagement isn't the same. It can be spurred by intermittent rewards, but it's not consistent and there's no direction. In fact, you can get people using it to suggest things like putting air fresheners in bathrooms, which are better left for suggestion boxes. But if you think about innovation simply as a solution to a problem, a need, or an approach to an opportunity, the best way to set people up to innovate without any whistles and bells is to simply pose a problem for them to solve. But one of the keys here is ensuring that the problem statement itself is broad enough. For example, if you ask somebody what kind of birthday party they should throw for a colleague, you've already framed it with the answer, right? You're answering part of it with a birthday party. Instead, ask a question like, how do we make the day memorable for them? So that the question isn't incorporating an answer and doesn't limit possibilities. So how are you positioning the brainstorming that can really affect the ideas you want your people to come up with? There's also something to be said for competition, right? Having people put together pitches, plans, a Shark Tank-like forum can create buy-in, commitment, visibility. For all of this, you want to provide timelines as well. Open-ended calls for ideas without a deadline doesn't generally work well. And then with process, you want to think about how are you putting together a pipeline of projects? Is it a firm-wide call? Are there teams? Do you opt in? Is it by function? Is it department? How is a project proposed? And when there's an idea, how is the solution defined? Who's creating it, right? Who is taking responsibility for that roughly defined idea and its execution? There's more than one effective answer, but in different firms and for different purposes across those firms, multiple approaches can all work. But the process also needs to consider people, roles, and accountability. Back in 1985, Peter Drucker published Innovation and Entrepreneurship. And back then he explained that you needed to separate innovation-oriented teams from other ones. You need a separate business altogether because it's really hard to mix the everyday roles that are responsible for innovation with succeeding in innovation projects and transformation projects. Eisner-Amper started by taking somebody off the production line because the chances are pretty low that you're going to effectively build something or transform something when you're relying on people who can only focus on it when they don't have client work to do. And finally, are you preparing for success and failure, right? Success seems easy at first glance, but have you thought about the new skills people will need to learn, or the knowledge they'll need to understand, or the different things they'll be able to offer the clients? Will some of these changes be of concern to your clients? How are they being communicated to non-tech savvy clients? And what are you doing about failure? Are you actually thinking about how you cut things off and how you let them run, when and why? Ultimately, I see the major work around innovation and transformation falling into three main categories, and that's important in defining who, what, and how you address them. The first is the tools. What are we using in our processes to produce or support our work and communicate and collaborate with clients? The next is the knowledge. How are we supporting our people to become experts? Experts on changes that affect our clients, that affect accounting, around emerging technology. I'm not just talking about blockchain. How are drones going to impact things? 3D printing. Based on your firm and your client base, where do you start? And finally, the biggest piece is introducing new services and products. This can be driven and enhanced by the tools you're developing, by the expertise you're developing. It can also be reverse engineered. This is where some real innovation can occur, and you can distinguish yourself from other firms. What is your value to your clients, and how could that manifest itself in very different ways in new services and new products? And when you figure out where you want to focus, it helps you better define the structure, the skills, the budget, and the people you need. So let's take a quick look at some of the options in more detail. Right? Let's start with the tools. The primary goal here is to have some staff focus on high value activity, right? So even though you can identify where you want to start, first, before you get to digitization and automation, you really need to start with the process. Can it be repeated? Can it be standardized? But it doesn't stop with automation. It actually starts there. Eventually, we're going to need to move beyond scanning PDFs, and information is going to be accessed differently. Automation is a tool to support those steps. And what it could do is limitless, right? Once the data is integrated from multiple sources, many things become possible. Look at what's happening with the larger banks right now. They've been looking for more loan processors. Their systems still can't, they still involve so many manual processes, they can't keep up with the loan application from the CARES Act. So smaller banks have emerged more recently, or maybe set up systems to become more efficient, right? And they hadn't invested in expensive, disconnected legacy enterprise systems. So they're able to aggregate and assess your information in a more efficient manner, much like you can do when you start integrating all of this digitized information. And they're doing something with that data that makes them unique. They're processing it to see what else they can do and disrupt banking and finance overall, right? This is nothing new. Payment platforms like digital payment alternatives, you might have heard of companies like Square and PayPal. They've been leveraging the cash flow data they have about their customers to increasingly develop as alternative lenders. PayPal's digital lending to small businesses went from $500 million in May 2015 to reaching over 225,000 businesses and over $10 billion by this time last year. So with QuickBooks Capital, business owners were able to now access small business loans from inside their own bookkeeping software, right? They used machine learning models and fed it anonymized data from QuickBooks, and Intuit products allowed the company to get a pretty robust picture of the current financial state of a small business. And more importantly, they were able to predict the company's future cash flow and to pay back a loan. So COVID-19 and the CARES Act has accelerated all of this. In fact, in April, you might be aware, Deloitte announced that it formed a partnership with Uncork and started working with Plaid, and they launched a fully managed small business lending service to help speed up the loan processing. They're taking advantage of all these gaps left by antiquated big banks. So what can you come up with, right? This is where you innovate. The integration allows you not to just create dashboards, go further than that. What kind of partnerships can you form? Where are there gaps in the ecosystem? Where are your clients' needs, right? You don't need to look at all of this insane amount of data that you already have on clients and feel like you need to sell them out. You don't need to make money selling their data. How can you use it to provide more value for them? And that's where the real opportunity is. So now let's focus on orienting people to innovation. How can you create a continuous process of learning and adapting to both internal and external circumstances? Basically, how do you future-proof your people? What topics do they need to understand? Not just for their work, for their clients' work. Do they need knowledge or do they actually need skills? Do they need to understand something like tokenization or do they actually need to learn Python? So what levels of expertise do they need? Do they simply need to understand the taxonomy and recognize it in client conversations? Or do they need to understand things like how blockchain and smart contracts are impacting cash flow, more of the application? Or is it more industry-specific initiatives, something like real estate tokenization? And so there's a lot of ways to do this. You can always move to firm-wide training, but people generally don't respond well to things that are required, right? It's not embraced the same way. There's been a lot of traction around lunch and learn type activities because people are realizing that they don't just want to learn more, but they need to learn more. But what about something exclusive, right? Bring in some psychology. What if you could distinguish yourself? So EisnerAmper launched a program that called for people who wanted to become emerging tech ambassadors. It required people to go above and beyond their normal workload for an entire year. It involved interviews and some other hoops, right? So we found out a lot of things in doing this. Opting in fared far better than just getting nominated because we were able to uncover people who actually had an interest and expertise we would have never known about, right? People who are willing to work hard but may not have been selected. So there's a very clear line also between people who wanted to learn knowledge and people who wanted to learn skills and what they wanted to do with those things. So you couple that with accountability and expectations for the program, and then you learn from it. But remember, this is promoting innovation. So as people are gaining visibility as part of the requirements, there's people who want to go beyond this or in a different direction than the exact structure or the topics. And they were able to create their own paths and improvise and change course along the way. And then you do that with the entire program as it continues and expands. So it's important to think critically as you implement any kind of program like this so that they can develop more significantly and become more effective in the future. Finding the right balance and when to involve everybody is critical, right? You want small teams so things can happen quickly. You want the technophiles to make the ideas more robust. But again, if you don't have a structure to support this and get the right people to weigh in, it creates a ton of problems. The trick is understanding when. And each firm and function is different. So while there may be individuals or teams responsible for development, a large-scale change around orienting a firm to innovation and transformation is going to be supported by all of these areas. If you don't include marketing, it's hard to make your brilliance and accomplishments known. But if you're leveraging data and IT doesn't know what kind of infrastructure you need or legal and risk recommendations for what we can do with that data or what kind of infrastructure you want, it's going to turn into a mess. So there's enough on this page for an entire conference, but I think you can see where I'm headed. If you aren't comprehensively prepared for transformation or innovation, it can break down in a lot of different places that you weren't even expecting. But let's end on a positive note. We're going to assume that you successfully identified and executed innovation and transformation initiatives, and I'm going to congratulate you in advance. But if you want more information or more ideas or more details on any programs or ways of approaching things, please feel free to reach out, and I want to thank you for listening.